They found him wandering the edge of the old river marsh in the autumn of 1799, barefoot and speaking in a language no one recognized. He was gaunt, but not weak, his eyes alert and unblinking, and though his clothes were ragged from years of wear, they were arranged with deliberate care, as though he had dressed for a ritual rather than survival. When asked his name, he gave it without hesitation, Samuel Hawthorne. But when asked where he had come from, his lips curled into a faint, eerie smile, and he answered in a voice low and steady, "I am not from here. I am from a place you cannot see." This was the first official encounter with the man who would, over the next decade, become a whispered nightmare in New England. At the time, his claim sounded like the ravings of a vagrant. But the townspeople who took him in, who offered him food and shelter in the village of Dunstable, Massachusetts, quickly learned that Samuel was no ordinary drifter. He spoke with a calm certainty that disarmed even skeptics. He described places and phenomena that had no meaning to anyone present. He drew diagrams of structures no one had seen, and most unsettling of all, he spoke as if he knew the people around him already, as if he had seen their faces long before they had seen his. Within weeks of his arrival, strange occurrences began to follow him. Livestock were found dead without obvious cause, their bodies arranged in deliberate patterns. Children spoke of dreams in which Samuel stood at the foot of their beds, whispering in an unknown tongue. Adults who had hosted him woke in the night to find him sitting silently by their hearths, eyes open but unblinking, as though watching something they could not see. Yet he was polite, never threatening outright. And for reasons no one could explain, few dared to turn him away. The minister of Dunstable later wrote in his journal, "It was not that we welcomed him, but that we could not bring ourselves to refuse him." There was a quality about the man that made refusal seem dangerous. When pressed about his claim of being from another world, Samuel would not offer details in the way a liar might. Instead, he spoke in fragments, in parables. "Your world is a veil," he once told a gathering at the town meeting house. "I walked through it when I was small. I was sent back because you needed a witness." His voice was calm, his gaze steady. He never shouted, never ranted. His composure gave weight to his words, turning them from madness into something the villagers could not easily dismiss. Even those who did not believe him felt a shiver when he spoke. As his presence lengthened, darker patterns emerged. People who opposed him, who mocked his claims or tried to drive him away, began to suffer misfortunes. One merchant who accused him of theft lost his home to fire days later. A deacon who called him the devil's orphan was found in the woods with his mind shattered, unable to recall his own name. None of these incidents could be traced directly to Samuel, yet his shadow hung over them all. Some began to whisper that he was a witch, others that he was a charlatan. But the question no one wanted to ask aloud was the simplest. What if he truly was from somewhere else? Not because of demons, but because of something worse. Because he had chosen to come here? It was only later, after Samuel Hawthorne had left Dunstable and his story began to spread across the colonies, that his origins came to light. He had not appeared from nothing. He had been born in 1765 in a small hamlet in Connecticut, the son of a cooper and a seamstress. Neighbors remembered him as a strange child, quiet, with a tendency to wander the woods alone for hours. He would return from these wanderings with pockets full of stones and feathers, speaking of places no one had shown him. He would point to a grove, one neighbor recalled decades later, and say there was a house there, though we saw nothing but trees. His parents tried to curb his imagination, but as he grew, his strangeness only deepened. From the age of 8, Samuel began to tell his family that he did not belong to them. He claimed he had been sent to live among them as a test. His mother reportedly wept when he refused to call her by name, referring to her only as the woman who keeps me. Teachers described him as intelligent but unsettling. He excelled at memorization, but often filled his notebooks with symbols and shapes no one could decipher. In sermons at the village church, he would sit motionless, eyes fixed not on the preacher, but on some point above the pulpit, as if studying something invisible. By his teenage years, the pattern of his visits to hidden places had become more alarming. He was found once at night in the graveyard, speaking softly to the headstones as though answering questions. Another time he disappeared for 3 days and was discovered miles away in an abandoned mill, drawing elaborate circles on the walls with chalk he had brought from home. When asked why, he answered, "They will see me better this way." Who they were, he never said. Neighbors whispered of fits, of visions, of a boy touched by something unholy. But his father refused to believe it, insisting Samuel was simply peculiar. That denial ended abruptly when Samuel, at 15, led 3 younger children into the woods and left them there overnight, claiming he was showing them the way back to where we came from. The children were found unharmed but terrified, babbling about a dark place Samuel had led them to. After this, his parents sent him to live with an uncle in Boston, hoping city life would cure his strangeness. Instead, Boston amplified it. Samuel found work as an apprentice to a printer, but his obsession with his other world deepened. He filled margins of pamphlets with coded notes and cryptic phrases. He began to hold small gatherings in alleys and taverns, speaking to whoever would listen about a world beyond sight. He claimed he had been sent back here to observe and prepare. A few curious souls followed him at first, thinking him an eccentric philosopher. But those who stayed too long with him reported nightmares, paranoia, and sudden illness. One man wrote in a letter, "He looks at you as though he can see not your face, but your thoughts." By the time he arrived in Dunstable in 1799, Samuel was no longer merely strange. He was something else entirely. He had become a man who believed his delusion so completely that it exerted power over others, bending their fear into obedience. He spoke little of doctrine, yet his presence alone was enough to make the rational doubt themselves. "He did not persuade you," the minister later wrote. "He simply made you feel that disbelief was dangerous." Even now, over 2 centuries later, historians debate what Samuel Hawthorne truly was. Was he a cunning manipulator, weaving a mythology to cloak his crimes? Was he a madman who believed his own story so deeply that others began to believe it too? Or was he, as he claimed, from a world beyond ours, sent to witness and to terrify? The records we have, court documents, letters, diaries, paint a portrait, not of a monster in the traditional sense, but of something more insidious. A man whose madness was so steady, so patient, so confident, that it infected those around him like a sickness. By starting our story at his arrival in Dunstable, we see the culmination of decades of this quiet infection. But to understand the terror he inspired, the terror that still lingers in whispered legends of New England, we must return to his beginnings, to the boy who sat in graveyards and spoke to shadows, to the youth who led children into the woods and told them they did not belong here. For Samuel Hawthorne's story is not one of sudden madness, but of a slow, deliberate unraveling. A story that began long before the villagers of Dunstable took him in and asked him who he was, and he told them, without hesitation, "I am not from here." They say madness comes suddenly like a fever, but in Samuel Hawthorne it grew slow and patient, like ivy creeping up the walls of a house until the structure inside is smothered. By the time he reached 20 years old, he no longer spoke of himself as belonging to his family or even to his community. In letters written during his years in Boston, there are phrases that repeat like a chant, "I am the witness. I am not bound to this soil. This body is a vessel, not my own." What unsettled those who knew him was not the strangeness of his words, but the calmness with which he said them. Unlike zealots who shouted their visions, Samuel spoke in measured tones, with the composure of a clerk reading from a ledger. His convictions were delivered without urgency, as though he already knew they were true and did not care if others accepted them. That calm certainty was what began to draw people in. At first, they were curious. A handful of young men from the printing shop where he apprenticed would meet him in taverns, asking him to speak of his world. He would describe it not as a place of fire and wonder, but as a colder reflection of their own. He told them it was vast, silent, without need of sun or stars. He spoke of figures who moved without form, who had chosen him as a kind of envoy. "I do not remember all of it," he admitted once. because they have taken pieces of me to keep. That is the toll of crossing. Some dismissed this as metaphor. Others left his company pale and shaken. One apprentice claimed that after hearing Samuel speak for an hour, he awoke the next 3 nights to see Samuel's face at the foot of his bed, silent and staring, though he lived 2 streets away. By the mid-1780s, Samuel had left the printing trade altogether. He wandered from town to town across Massachusetts and New Hampshire, earning small wages as a laborer, but always drawing attention for his strange presence. Wherever he stayed, whispers followed. Families who hosted him spoke of cold drafts in rooms with no open windows, of sudden silences in the middle of conversation, as though sound itself had been pulled away. A farmer's daughter in Groton later wrote in her diary that Samuel once asked her, very gently, "Do you know what you would look like in the other place?" She never forgot the stillness of his expression when she told him no. This was the period when the first true disappearances began. In 1787, 2 young boys in Lowell were last seen following Samuel into the woods. Having told their parents, he promised to show them where he came from. Their bodies were never found, though searchers reported strange markings in the soil, like circles dug deliberately with a stick. Samuel was questioned, but nothing tied him directly to the case. He answered calmly that the boys went home and no one pressed him further. A year later, a woman in Concord vanished after hosting Samuel for 3 nights. Her home was found locked from the inside, her belongings untouched. Neighbors recalled seeing Samuel walking along the road the morning she disappeared, carrying nothing, speaking to no one. When confronted, he simply said, "She followed me. She wanted to see." In each of these cases, the evidence was too thin for prosecution. Samuel slipped away before towns could act, moving like a shadow across the countryside, leaving behind unanswered questions and growing fear. He never raised his voice, never threatened, never confessed. And yet those who looked into his eyes often felt a shiver so profound it bordered on belief. By the early 1790s, his name was whispered in taverns and churchyards. Mothers warned their children not to stray with him. Ministers denounced him as a fraud or a witch, though some quietly admitted unease. A few began to call him the stranger, a man unbound by place, who seemed to drift not only through villages, but through the boundaries of the natural order. In his own words, or at least those preserved in the journals he left behind, Samuel saw himself not as a deceiver, but as a patient observer. One surviving notebook, held today in a private collection, contains page after page of chilling lines. They are blind. They see only the skin of this world. "I see the marrow. I show them and they cannot look long." Elsewhere he wrote, "This body is a costume. I will wear it until they call me back. Until then, I watch." What emerges from these fragments is not the portrait of a raving lunatic, but of a man who believed his own story so fully that his entire existence bent toward proving it. And if the disappearances and misfortunes that trailed him were truly his doing, then his calmness made them all the more terrifying. He did not act in rage, nor in passion, but with the steady conviction of someone fulfilling a duty no one else could understand. By the time he entered Dunstable in 1799, his reputation had already rippled across several counties. He was no longer merely a curiosity. He was a figure of dread. Families who had heard whispers of him tried not to speak his name. Travelers swore they had seen him standing alone by crossroads at night, watching them pass without moving. And though he had never been formally charged with crime, the unspoken weight of vanished children and missing women hung on him like a cloak. Yet despite all this, when he knocked on doors, people let him in. That was perhaps the most disturbing fact of all. They could not explain why, but turning him away seemed unthinkable. It was as though his very presence eroded resistance. Once, when asked why she allowed Samuel to stay in her home, the widow replied, "Because if I did not, I felt he would still be here watching from the window." Historians today struggle to categorize Samuel Hawthorne. Was he an early example of what we might now call a psychopath? A man with no capacity for empathy, but endless patience for manipulation? Or was he, as his contemporaries feared, something more? A man whose delusion created a reality that others could not escape? The truth may lie in the way his victims described him before they vanished. Several diaries recovered from families he visited contain eerily similar lines. One child wrote, "He told me I am not real here." A woman noted, "He said I would be happier where he is from." Another man scrawled in the margin of a Bible, "His eyes are not his own." Individually, these remarks might seem like fragments of fear or imagination. Together they form a pattern too consistent to dismiss. Again and again, Samuel's victims spoke not of threats or violence, but of persuasion. Persuasion so subtle, so calm, that resistance seemed to dissolve. This is what made him terrifying. He did not drag people into the woods by force. He convinced them to walk there willingly. By the dawn of the 19th century, his legend was sealed. Samuel Hawthorne was no longer simply a man. He had become a myth of unease, a reminder that the most frightening monsters do not snarl or strike. They smile, they speak gently, and they make you believe. By the first years of the new century, Samuel Hawthorne had grown into something more than a wandering vagrant with strange ideas. He had become a story. His name passed through taverns and farmhouses the way a sickness might pass through a crowded street, whispered in half-belief, accompanied by warnings and shivers. And yet, for all the suspicion and dread he inspired, people continued to listen. In towns across Massachusetts and New Hampshire, groups began to form around him, not in the open like a church congregation, but in hushed private gatherings. A farmer's son in Chelmsford recalled years later that he had attended one of these meetings as a boy, dragged there by his older cousin. "It was not like a sermon," he said. "There was no thunder, no rage. He spoke as though he was telling you a secret that had waited centuries to be told, and you believed even when you did not want to." These gatherings had no name, no official creed. But Samuel carried with him the conviction of a man who did not need one. He called his listeners watchers and told them that their world was a mask, a skin stretched over something vast and unending. He promised no salvation, no glory, no heaven. What he offered was stranger, the chance to see through the skin. Witnesses described how he would sometimes sit silently for long minutes, staring into nothing until the room itself seemed to grow heavy. Then he would begin to speak in that same calm, deliberate way, painting images of the world he claimed as his own. Not a paradise, but a place of endless silence, where human fears and pains meant nothing. Some found it unbearable. Others found it strangely soothing. A blacksmith who attended 3 of these meetings later wrote, "It was as though he gave me permission to let go of myself, to imagine I was nothing more than a shadow." It was a horror, but also a relief. That relief was perhaps the most dangerous part. Samuel did not need to convince people he was from another world. He only needed to make them want to escape this one. It was in these secret meetings that the most disturbing events began to unfold. In 1803, a group of 5 men and women vanished from a farmstead outside Fitchburg after gathering with Samuel. Their neighbors found the house abandoned, food still on the table, chairs knocked over as if in haste. Samuel was seen walking alone on the road the next morning, his clothes unstained, his eyes untroubled. When questioned, he replied simply, "They are gone where they wish to go." Authorities searched for weeks but found nothing. The missing were never recovered. Their families, broken by grief, whispered that Samuel had shown them the door. Rumors spread quickly, and before long, he was regarded not merely as an eccentric, but as a man with the power to draw others into his delusion completely, body and soul. In the years that followed, similar disappearances dotted the map wherever he passed. Some vanished in groups, some alone. Not all were young or naive. Some were respected townspeople, men and women who should have known better. What tied them together was not weakness but contact with Samuel Hawthorne. What unsettled even more was that he was never found with money, valuables, or evidence of violence. He did not profit. He did not even flee when suspicion rose. He would stay in villages until driven out, never resisting, never arguing, only moving on when the pressure became too great. If pressed, he would say only, "They are with me still, but not here." The pattern of his influence took on a cult-like shape. Small groups began to speak of him as a guide rather than a madman. Letters seized by authorities in 1806 show a chilling devotion. One woman wrote, "He has shown me what I am not. I am not flesh. I am not bound. He will take me when it is time." Another described him as the mirror that breaks the lie of this place. None of these followers formed an organized church, but their obsession mirrored one. They met in barns and fields, sat in silence, and waited for Samuel's words. When he arrived, he spoke with the same calm patience, as if he were fulfilling a role rather than choosing it. When he left, they remained behind, hollowed by belief, ready for whatever came next. But not all encounters with him ended in devotion. Some ended in madness. A tavern keeper in Nashua claimed that after Samuel stayed in his home for 3 nights, his wife fell into a kind of waking trance. She would not speak, would not eat, but sat by the hearth whispering, "I am not here. I am not here." She died 2 months later, her body frail and wasted, her mind seemingly gone long before. Doctors of the time, limited in their understanding, called it hysteria or fever of the nerves, but those who knew Samuel blamed him. They said he had taken her away without moving her. Others reported similar stories, sudden declines in health, strange trances, people who seemed to vanish not in body but in spirit after speaking with him. By the late 1800s, his legend had spread so far that families began warning children with his name. "Do not follow the Hawthorne man," they would say, "or you will not return." Some even refused to speak his name at all, calling him instead the one who watches. In rural folklore, he became less a man than a presence, a figure who could unmake you simply by convincing you that you did not belong in the world you lived in. Yet for all the terror he inspired, he was never caught, never tried, never punished. He slipped between the cracks of law and superstition, always one step beyond reach. Ministers denounced him from pulpits, but his gatherings continued. Officials investigated disappearances, but evidence dissolved into whispers. He was a ghost in plain sight, not hiding, but never caught. Historians today look back on this period with a mix of fascination and unease. Was Samuel Hawthorne a manipulative predator, carefully weaving a philosophy to justify abduction and control? Or was he a delusional wanderer whose calm conviction simply broke weaker minds? The answer may be somewhere between the two. His madness was his mask, and through it, he convinced others to wear one as well. What we do know is that by the second decade of the 19th century, his influence had reached its height. People spoke of him not only in Massachusetts, but across the wider Northeast. Some even traveled to find him, seeking the man who claimed to be from another world. And when they found him, most were never seen again. For Samuel, the mask of our world grew thinner with each year. His journals from this time are filled with unsettling lines. "The veil is weakening. I am almost through. More are coming with me." Whether he believed he was preparing for departure or simply sinking further into delusion, the result was the same. His shadow lengthened, and those who stepped into it rarely escaped, and yet his story was not done. The final chapter of Samuel Hawthorne's life, the years that would cement his place as one of the most terrifying forgotten figures in American history, was still to come. By 1810, Samuel Hawthorne was no longer just a man. He had become a rumor that moved faster than he could travel, a living ghost whose name meant disappearance, whose presence meant dread. Across New England, he was whispered about like a curse. Mothers hushed their children with stories of him. Tavern talk ended abruptly when his name was spoken aloud. He was, in the eyes of the people, both human and not, and yet he walked among them still. His face was not hidden, his steps not hurried. He carried no weapons, no coin, no possessions beyond the notebooks he filled with strange drawings and lines of thought. When asked how he survived, he would smile faintly and reply, "The world carries me, because I am not of it." But even legends have an ending. The beginning of his fall came not through law or clergy, but through fear that reached a breaking point. In 1811, in the village of Ashby, a young woman named Lydia Abbott vanished after attending one of Samuel's gatherings in a barn outside town. She had been seen walking with him the night before, pale and silent, her eyes fixed on something no one else could see. When she did not return, her brothers searched the woods for days. They found only her bonnet, laid carefully on a stone. Samuel was nowhere to be seen. The Abbott family, unlike others before them, refused to let the matter vanish into whispers. They spoke openly of Samuel's influence, accusing him of leading Lydia away. Their cries found ears in neighboring villages, where others began to recall their own missing kin, their own encounters with the quiet man who spoke of other worlds. The fear that had kept tongues tied for decades began to unravel. For the first time, people spoke his name not in secret, but in fury. By the summer of that year, groups of men armed with muskets and torches began to track him. Reports placed him in Fitchburg, then Townsend, then deeper into the forests of New Hampshire. Each time he was gone by the time they arrived. He never fled in haste, but moved with the same slow certainty he always had, as if even pursuit could not disturb his composure. It was in the winter of 1812 that Samuel Hawthorne was finally caught. The story, preserved in fragments of journals and local records, tells that a group of 12 men cornered him in a deserted cabin near the town of Peterborough. Inside, they found him seated calmly by the hearth, his notebook spread before him. He looked up at them with no sign of surprise, as if he had been expecting them. When ordered to stand, he simply replied, "You are late." The men bound him and dragged him back to the town, where for days he was held in a cellar while authorities debated what to do. Some argued for trial, though no clear charge could be brought. Others whispered that no trial was needed, that Samuel was something beyond human justice. During his confinement, witnesses reported strange occurrences. The guards swore that at night he spoke in a voice that was not his own, deep and hollow, though no one else in the cellar heard it. A minister who attempted to pray over him emerged trembling, saying that Samuel's eyes had looked through me as though I were glass. He never resisted, never begged, never raised his voice. When asked directly about the disappearances, he would answer only, "They are not lost. They are where I come from. You will see when the skin tears." The town faced a choice. To hold him was to risk his influence spreading further. To free him was unthinkable. In the end, fear decided his fate. On a cold January night, a group of masked men took him from the cellar. No record names them, but local memory remembers them as farmers, fathers, brothers of the vanished. They led him into the forest and hung him from a great oak, leaving his body to swing in the winter wind. They did not speak of it afterward, and no official account records it. Samuel Hawthorne, who had walked through towns for decades with calm certainty, was erased not by law but by silence. But his story did not end there. In the weeks after his death, strange tales spread. Some claimed his body did not rot but remained whole, eyes open as if watching still. Others said the rope snapped on its own, and his corpse was never found. A traveling peddler swore he saw Samuel walking on the road weeks later, barefoot and smiling. Whether these were inventions born of fear or echoes of his legend, no one can say. What is certain is that his notebooks survived. Found scattered in the cabin where he had been seized, they passed from hand to hand, each reader unnerved by what they contained. Page after page of symbols, circles, and lines repeated endlessly, alongside phrases written with chilling steadiness. "This world is the veil. The marrow waits. I am not bound." Some pages were blank except for a single sentence, written dozens of times. "I will return when the skin tears." Historians today interpret these writings as evidence of deep delusion, the obsessions of a man consumed by his own madness. And yet, for those who study his life, the writings carry a weight that cannot be dismissed. They are not the ravings of a mind in chaos, but the steady, patient script of a man who believed every word. 2 centuries have passed since Samuel Hawthorne walked the backroads of New England. His name has faded from most histories, surviving only in obscure folklore and scattered documents. But in certain towns, his story is still told, not as legend but as warning. Parents tell their children not to follow strangers into the woods. Travelers quicken their pace when they feel watched on lonely roads. And in some farmhouses, old families still whisper before bed. Do not listen if the Hawthorne man speaks. Perhaps the most terrifying thing about Samuel Hawthorne was not what he did, but how he did it. He killed no one with his hands. He wielded no blade, fired no musket. His weapon was his conviction, his calm certainty that he was not of this world. And in that conviction he bent others to his will, until they stepped willingly into the shadows with him. Whether he was mad, manipulative, or truly touched by something beyond comprehension, we may never know. But the fact remains, dozens of men, women, and children vanished in his shadow, leaving only silence behind. And so the name Samuel Hawthorne lingers as a chilling reminder that sometimes the most frightening figure is not the monster who threatens you, but the man who convinces you that you were never real to begin with. Even now, some say that if you walk alone at night in the old woods of New England, you may hear a calm voice behind you, speaking gently, patiently, "I am not from here. Neither are you. And if you turn to look, you may not return." So when you think of Samuel Hawthorne, remember his lesson, and remember the fear he left behind. A fear that did not die with him, but continues to whisper generation after generation. If this story unsettled you, if it drew you in as his followers were once drawn, then let that fear stay with you. And if you want to hear more tales of forgotten horrors, of the shadows in history that are rarely spoken of, then I invite you, subscribe to this channel, leave a comment below, and share your thoughts. Every whisper helps keep the past alive, and perhaps somewhere Samuel Hawthorne is still listening.